My name is Vivian. I'm 27 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my life changed in just 31 seconds. That night at around 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed while I was sitting on my bed in my tiny studio apartment. One missed call from my mother. That alone was unusual because she rarely called me directly. Usually she would send short texts like call me back or send money. But this time it was a call, followed by a voicemail. I hesitated for a few seconds before pressing play, and for some reason I already felt uneasy, as if something was waiting for me on the other side of that message. Her voice came through clearly, coldly, and strangely calm, as if she had practiced every word in advance. Vivian, I want you to know that the family has made a decision. You are no longer welcome here. Don't come back. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're moving on without you. That was it. Just 31 seconds. No explanation, no reason, no why. Just a sentence delivered without a trial. I sat there in silence, my phone still in my hand, replaying the message. A second time. Then a third, as if I hoped I had misunderstood it, as if there might be some explanation hidden somewhere in the recording. But there was nothing. Just an ending, spoken with terrifying coldness. My first instinct was to call back, ask what I had done, and apologize if I had done something wrong, even though I had no idea what that could be. That was what I had done for years. Take the blame first, keep the peace later. But this time, something inside me stopped. It felt like a gear in my head had finally snapped and refused to keep turning the old way. I opened our text thread and typed one single word, okay. Then I hit send. No explanation, no questions. Just a tiny full stop at the end of a relationship I had spent my entire youth trying to protect. A few minutes later, I opened the family group chat, the one where my mother shared recipes. My father posted blurry bird pictures from the yard, and my younger sister was always the center of every conversation. I had been removed from it, not muted, not left on my own, removed completely. And the group name had been changed, too. It was no longer Owen's family. Now, it was simply us. Such a simple name, but painfully clear I was no longer part of us. I put my phone down and looked at the framed family photo on my shelf. It had been taken on my sister's graduation day. My mother was smiling brightly, my father had his hand on her shoulder, and I stood at the far edge of the frame almost cropped out. Maybe I had always been in that position. It was just that today, they finally made it official. And the most painful part wasn't being told to leave. It was realizing that I had always been standing on the outside. I just had never been brave enough to admit it. If you have ever felt like your own family treated you like an outsider, comment one. I want to know how you went through it. After I sent the word okay, there was no response. No typing bubbles, no callback, no message, explaining anything, or even confirming that they had read it. And that silence told me everything. They weren't expecting me to agree, they were expecting me to react. They expected panic-repeated calls, questions like, why apologies without knowing what I had done wrong, and an attempt to fix something they had already decided to break. It was a familiar script, one I had played over and over for years, without realizing I was just a supporting character in my own family's story. But this time I didn't do that. Not because I suddenly became stronger, but because I was exhausted. Too exhausted to keep running in a loop that always ended the same way with me bending first. I put my phone down, lay back on my bed, and stared at the ceiling where the soft yellow light created a dim glow. There were no immediate tears, no dramatic emotional breakdown like people might expect. Just emptiness, a strange stillness, as if something inside me had finally burned out after running for too long. I started thinking, but not emotionally. My mind shifted into the mode I knew best: analysis. If they could cut me out of the family with a single voicemail, what did that mean? It meant my role in the family was never truly daughter. It was a function, a resource, a solution whenever there was a problem. And if they had decided they no longer needed me, then the real question was, what part of me did they not need? The person I was, or what I provided? That thought made me sit up immediately. I grabbed my laptop almost instinctively. Not to send emails or messages, but to do what I always do when things become unclear: organize data. I created a new file and named it simply family financial obligations. Then I started typing. Line by line, expense by expense, mortgage payments, insurance, Brooke's car. All the just this once, requests that kept repeating. Emergencies, the things that were never mentioned again once I had paid for them. At first I thought it would be a short list, but the more I typed, the longer it became. The numbers began stacking on top of each other, forming a picture I had never seen in full before. I had always looked at each piece separately, a transfer here, a favor there, a monthly payment, but never the whole. And when I finally saw it, when I looked at the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet, I didn't feel proud. I didn't even feel angry right away. I felt awake. The okay I sent was not acceptance. It was not fine, I'll leave. It was a quiet decision. If they could live without me, then I would stop living for them. No more monthly transfers. No more crisis management. No more playing the perfect daughter who always sacrifices. Okay was not the end of me. It was the end of the role I had been forced to play. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of heartbreak, but because my mind had never been clearer. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to fix the relationship. I was thinking about what it truly was. And once you see something clearly enough, you can never go back to the way you used to see it. Okay is a very small word. But for me, it was the first boundary I had ever drawn for myself. As the spreadsheet filled up, I began to see something I had avoided for a long time. Everything in my family had a price, and I was always the one paying it. At first, I only planned to list a few major expenses for clarity, but then the smaller ones started appearing as if they had been waiting to be acknowledged. The monthly mortgage payments steady and unquestioned. Health insurance for my parents, something they treated as a given. Brooke's car loan, the same white SUV she proudly posted online, with the caption blessed, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Then came the emergencies, my dad's back injury, the leaking roof, before winter Brooke's security deposit, when she moved out, then back in, then out again. Every time I didn't think twice. I just sent the money as if it were a natural reflex. But when all those numbers sat on the same screen, they were no longer separate acts. They became a pattern, a system. And I was at the center of it. I scrolled down to the bottom line where the total was bolded. 143美元, 214. I stared at that number for a long time, not because I didn't believe it, but because I had never allowed myself to face it. $143,000, 6 years of my life, and in return a 3-1. Second voicemail telling me I was no longer part of the family. What bothered me wasn't the money itself, but the fact that it had never been acknowledged. Not a single thank you. Not once did anyone say, "We know how much you've done." All I ever received was silence, or worse, the expectation that I would keep doing it. I wasn't loved for who I was. I was kept around because I was useful. And the moment they thought they could remove me, while still keeping what I provided, that's when they made their biggest mistake. I started opening every saved file, every receipt, every confirmation email. My habit of documenting everything, something I once thought was excessive, had now become the clearest evidence of my role. I hadn't just helped. I had funded their lives. And the most ironic part was that while I was consistently sending money every month, my own account often hit zero. There were days I had to calculate every meal delay, paying my own student loans, telling myself, it's just temporary. But it was never temporary, because I was the one keeping it going. Sitting there, I realized a simple but painful truth. I hadn't been used in a single moment, or one bad decision. I had placed myself in that position, repeating the same choice, over and over, believing it was how I kept my family close. But in reality, I didn't keep anything. I only prolonged a system, where I was the only one paying the cost. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty, thinking about stopping. After seeing the full financial picture, I started digging deeper into the documents. At first, it was just to double-check everything, but the more I looked, the more I realized the issue wasn't just about money. It was about control. I opened every file in my cloud folder: mortgage contracts, property deeds, my grandmother's trust documents. Everything I had signed without much thought at the time, because I believed I was helping my family, not binding myself into a long-term structure. Then I paused at one detail that made me read it again and again: my name. It wasn't there just once. It was in the most critical places. I wasn't just someone who helped financially. I was the co-signer on the mortgage. I was a co-owner on the deed. And most importantly, I was the sole trustee of my grandmother's $86,000 fund for family education and medical needs. Every critical financial thread ran through me. Without realizing it, I had become the foundation holding everything together. I sat there for a few minutes, letting that sink in. They had just sent me a voicemail cutting me off. They had removed me from the family. But they had forgotten one very basic thing: I wasn't just a member. I was the foundation. If I walked away, it wouldn't just be one person leaving. It would be the entire structure behind them starting to shake. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel cold. Because if they truly understood my role and still chose to cut me off, then either they had miscalculated or they believed they could replace me. And if they believed that, then something was happening behind the scenes that I didn't yet know. I went back to the joint bank account I had set up to handle family expenses. The moment I logged in, I noticed something was wrong. The contact email had been changed. My email was no longer there. In its place was one I recognized immediately: Brooks. I checked the timestamp. 2 days before the voicemail. 2 days. That meant my removal from the family wasn't emotional. It was part of a plan. My heartbeat slowed, not out of fear, but because everything was becoming clear in a very unsettling way. I kept digging through my emails and found a notification from the title company. The subject line read "Beneficiary Amendment, Pending Confirmation." I opened the attachment. It was a request form to remove my name from the property deed. Submitted by Brooke, listed as an authorized family representative. I had never authorized anyone to represent me. At that point, there was no more doubt. Everything connected. They didn't just want me out of the family. They wanted me off the paperwork, off the control, off every piece of evidence that proved I had built what they were living on. The voicemail wasn't the beginning, it was the final step. A distraction meant to keep me from seeing what was happening behind the scenes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time I didn't feel hurt. I felt clear, completely clear, because in my job I analyze risk and detect fraud patterns, and what I was looking at now was no longer just a family issue. It was a pattern I had seen many times before, just never imagined I would see it in my own life. Once I put all the pieces together, I could no longer convince myself that this was just a misunderstanding or an emotional outburst. Everything was too clear, too structured to be random. The email was changed first. The request to remove my name from the property was submitted before anything else, and only after that did the voicemail arrive like a perfectly timed conclusion. That meant while I was still working, still sending money, still believing I was part of the family, they were already removing me, step by step behind the scenes. I opened the amendment form again and read it carefully, line by line. Brooke's name appeared as the submitter, labeled as an authorized family representative. I almost laughed when I saw that. Authorized, I had never signed anything giving her that authority. But what caught my attention the most was the signature. My name was there, or at least something that looked like it. At first glance, it was convincing. The slant was right, the size was similar, even the finishing stroke was imitated. But there was one detail that was wrong: the O in my last name. I always write it with a slightly open loop. The one on the document was completely closed. A tiny difference, but enough for me to know one thing for certain: someone had forged my signature. I didn't panic. There was no dramatic burst of anger like you see in movies. Instead, I felt something cold and clear. Because at this point, this was no longer about emotions. It was about facts. And facts don't need arguments, they need proof. I reconstructed the timeline in my head. Brooke changed the account email, then submitted the forged document. Then my mother sent the voicemail to officially cut me off. 3 steps. Clean. Ordered. This wasn't a family falling apart. This was a plan being executed. What made me think the most wasn't just what they did, it was that they believed I wouldn't notice. They assumed I would react the old way. Panic, breakdown, try to fix things. And while I was distracted, they would finish removing me from everything. They didn't expect one simple thing: I was no longer that version of myself. And this time, I wasn't looking at the situation emotionally, I was looking at it logically. I downloaded every related file, saved copies to my computer, backed them up on a USB, and emailed them to myself. If there was one thing my job had taught me, it was this: evidence matters more than words. And at this point, I had enough evidence to understand exactly what was happening. I sat there quietly, for a moment, then asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before: if this wasn't a family in pain, but a group of people trying to remove me from what I had built, then why should I keep protecting them? The answer came faster than I expected. There was no reason left. If you discovered that someone close to you was quietly manipulating or using you, would you stay silent or walk away? Comment 2. As everything in the present became clearer, I realized I needed to go back to the past to understand how things had reached this point. Because the truth is, nothing in my family happened suddenly. It all started very early, very quietly, and was repeated so often that it became normal. I clearly remember a summer afternoon when I was 14 and Brooke was 10. Our parents called us to the table to explain the plan for the summer. Brooke would attend a 4-week art camp, something she was excited about. And me, I would stay home, watch her before camp, cook after she came back, do laundry, and make sure the house didn't fall apart while our parents worked. I gently asked if I could join a free math program at the community college since I qualified. My mom simply shook her head and said, "Someone has to stay home for your sister. You're the older one, you understand." And I did understand. Not because I agreed, but because I knew the answer wouldn't change. From that moment on, a role was defined. Brooke was the one who was taken care of, and I was the one who took care of others. Brooke was the one invested in, and I was the one doing the investing. When I did well in school, my mother's reaction wasn't pride. It was expectation. Good. Keep it up. One of you has to make real money someday. There was no praise, no recognition, just a projection of a future where I would become the family's source of income. In contrast, when Brooke failed an exam, the whole house rallied around her. My dad took her out for ice cream. My mom held her and said, "You're more than a test score." I stood in the next room hearing every word. No one ever said that to me, not because I didn't need it, but because they believed I could handle it. That feeling followed me for years. I wasn't just the older daughter, I was the strong one. And in my family, being strong wasn't a compliment. It was a responsibility, an excuse for others not to care about you. When I went to college and later started working, that role didn't disappear. It simply changed form. Instead of giving my time, I started giving money. The first time I received a paycheck, I felt proud for a few hours. That same evening, my mom called. My dad had hurt his back and needed help with medical bills. I sent the money immediately without hesitation. A few weeks later, Brooke needed a security deposit for her apartment. I asked if she had any savings, and that simple question was instantly turned into selfishness. "That's your sister, how can you even ask that?" And once again, I sent the money. None of this happened in a single moment. It built up gradually, like drops of water filling a glass, until it overflowed. But because it happened slowly, I never realized I was being pushed into a position I had never truly chosen. I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing the right thing. But in reality, I was being conditioned to believe that my value came from what I could provide, not who I was. Looking back now, I'm no longer surprised by what happened in the present. That voicemail, that plan, that betrayal, they weren't exceptions. They were the inevitable result of a system that had existed for years. A system where one person kept giving and everyone else became used to receiving without question. And when that person finally stopped, everything began to collapse. Not because they were wrong, but because they were never allowed to stop before. In the years after I started working, I began to realize something I had never clearly named before. I was no longer just a daughter in the family. I had become a steady financial source. No one ever said it out loud. There was no formal conversation about it, but the way they acted made it painfully obvious. Every time my phone lit up with my mother's name, I already knew what it would be about. Not, "How are you?" Not, "How's work?" But almost always a problem that needed solving, and the solution was usually money. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was just a difficult phase for the family. My dad's back injury, unexpected medical costs, Brooke starting her own life, needing initial support. Those reasons sounded reasonable, even justified. They made me feel like it was my responsibility to help. But over time, those special situations stopped being special. They became routine. 1 month then, 2 then, a year. Small amounts slowly turned into larger ones, but the way they asked never changed. it always felt temporary. What made me realize things had shifted wasn't the amount of money. It was the tone. It was no longer a request but an expectation. No more can you help. Instead it became, send this for me. A small change in wording, but a completely different meaning. It was no longer a question. It was an assumption. An assumption that I would always say yes, always be available, always fill whatever gap they couldn't handle themselves. I remember one time my account was nearly empty. I had been carefully budgeting my own expenses, delaying my student loan payments, cutting everything unnecessary. In my mind, I kept telling myself, just get through this phase, and things will be okay. But then, my phone rang. Brooke needed money to fix her car. Again. For the first time in years, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I wasn't sure I could keep doing this. I asked a simple question. Can Brooke handle this herself? The silence on the other end was heavier than any answer. When my mom finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it had turned cold. That's your sister. How can you even ask? That my question in their eyes wasn't reasonable. It was betrayal. I sent the money anyway, like I always did. But something felt different. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was helping. I felt trapped. And that trap didn't come from contracts or legal obligations. It came from something more powerful: guilt. They didn't need to force me, because they knew I would pressure myself. In the years that followed, nothing really changed. I kept sending money, solving problems as they came up, and in return I received silence. No thank you, no acknowledgement, not even a simple question about my life. There were days I felt like I only existed in my family when they needed something. Outside of those moments, I was invisible. I began to face a truth I had long avoided. I wasn't just helping my family. I was sustaining a system where I was the only one responsible. And the most dangerous part was that the system worked perfectly until I started asking questions. Because once you ask, why is it always me? You can never go back to how things were before. I don't know exactly when I became the money machine in their eyes. Maybe there was no single moment. It happened gradually, piece by piece, every time I said yes, every time I put their needs before mine. And by the time I realized it, that role had become the default. Not because they forced it on me, but because I had never said no. And that might be the hardest part to accept. If there is one moment I could go back and change, it would be the day I agreed to co-sign the house. At the time, I didn't think it was a big decision. In my mind, it was just a way to help my parents have a more stable life. My mom called me with a hopeful tone, saying they had found the perfect house: 3 bedrooms, a quiet neighborhood, a place for the future. But then she reached the important part: they couldn't get approved for the loan. Their credit history had been damaged by old debts, medical bills, and missed payments. No bank was willing to approve them. The solution, as she presented it, sounded simple. You just need to co-sign Vivian. You have good credit. It's still the family's home. One day it will belong to you and Brooke. She said it as if it were obvious, as if putting my name on a major loan was just a natural extension of being a daughter. I didn't ask many questions. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't request any formal agreement beyond the bank documents, because, in my mind, there was a simple belief: family doesn't need contracts. Family is where you trust without conditions. So I signed. My name went onto the mortgage, onto the deed. Legally, I was a co-owner of that house. But reality was very different. As soon as the house was purchased, Brooke moved in immediately. She chose the largest bedroom, decorated it, and posted photos online about her home. Meanwhile, I stayed in my small apartment, working longer hours to make sure the monthly payments were always made on time. On the rare occasions I visited, I didn't have a room. I slept on a pull-out couch in the living room, while the largest bedroom belonged to someone who hadn't contributed a single dollar toward buying the house. At first, I told myself it didn't matter, that this was a family home, not a personal issue. But over time, that feeling became harder to ignore. I was paying for something I didn't actually have the right to use. The $1,850 monthly payment became a fixed part of my life. No one mentioned it. No one thanked me. But it was always there, steady, precise, like a heartbeat that only I could feel. Some months I had to work extra hours just to make sure I wouldn't fall behind. But in my family's eyes, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was simply what I was supposed to do. About 6 months before everything fell apart, I overheard something that changed everything. I was on the phone with my mom and thought the call had ended, but it hadn't. I heard her talking to Brooke in the background. Once we refinance, we can pull some equity out. Don't worry about Vivian, I'll handle her. Handle me. Not talk to me, not ask me, but handle me like I was a problem to be managed. I didn't say anything at the time. I hung up and tried to convince myself I had misheard. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. And looking back, that sentence was a warning I chose to ignore. They didn't see me as a co-owner. They saw me as a stepping stone, a tool to reach their goal. My mistake wasn't helping my family. My mistake was believing that my help would be valued. I thought putting my name on that house meant I had a place in it. But the truth was, I had responsibility without ownership. And when they decided to remove me, they didn't think I had any right to keep even a part of what I had helped build. That wasn't just a financial mistake. It was a lesson about boundaries that I learned far too late. If the house was my biggest financial mistake, then my grandmother's trust fund was where everything began to crack in a very visible way. My grandmother passed away 4 years ago after a short but intense illness. But even in her final days, she remained sharp and clear-minded. She didn't leave behind a large fortune, but she did leave $86, 0 inches a trust, with a very specific purpose to be used for the family's education and medical needs. And more importantly, she named only one person to manage it: me. Not my mother, not Brooke, me. I remember clearly the day the lawyer read the will. The room felt heavier the moment my name was mentioned as the trustee. My mother didn't say anything right away, but the look on her face told me she wasn't happy. On the drive home, she made a single comment: "Your grandmother didn't understand how things work. That money should be managed by the whole family." I replied quietly, "I am the family mom." But she didn't respond. And from that moment, I knew my role wasn't accepted. It was simply tolerated. For the next 3 years, the trust remained mostly untouched. I managed it according to the terms and no one complained, at least not directly to me. Then Brooke came back with a request. She wanted $15,000 to start an online business. An idea she had seen on social media with no clear plan or structure. When she asked, her tone was confident, almost as if my agreement was guaranteed. But this time I couldn't say yes. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I didn't have the right to use that money for something like that. The trust had clear rules, and I had a responsibility to follow them. So I said no. A simple word, but it carried consequences. Brooke started crying, as she often did when things didn't go her way. She called my mom, and as always, my mom called me next. But this time, it wasn't to ask, it was to criticize. "Your grandmother would have wanted to help Brooke. You're being controlling." I tried to explain that I was simply doing my legal duty, that violating the terms could cause serious problems. But logic had no place in that conversation. In their eyes, I wasn't protecting the trust, I was hoarding it. For 2 months after that, Brooke didn't speak to me. No messages, no calls. And during that time, I started hearing things from relatives. A cousin reached out and carefully asked if it was true that I was keeping Grandma's money for myself. I didn't respond directly, but I understood exactly what was happening. Brooke had told her own version of the story, a version where I was selfish, where I refused to help even though I could. I didn't try to correct that narrative. Not because I couldn't, but because I was too tired to explain myself again. What I didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't just gossip, it was groundwork. It was building an image of me, one that would later be used when things escalated further. Looking back now, I understand that the moment I said no to Brooke wasn't just a financial decision. It was the first time I broke an unspoken rule in my family, that I was always supposed to say yes. And when you break a rule that has existed for so long, the reaction isn't just disappointment, it's resistance. Have you ever been misunderstood just because you said no? If yes, comment 3. About 2 months before everything fell apart, Brooke called me. At the time, the call didn't seem unusual. Her tone was softer than usual, almost warm, as if she genuinely wanted to clear the air. After weeks of not speaking because of the trust fund conflict, I thought maybe she had calmed down, maybe things were returning to normal. And that was my mistake, I believed it. We talked for about 40 minutes, starting with small talk, simple life updates, then gradually moving into familiar territory, family money, and things that needed to be simplified. At first, nothing seemed off. Brooke talked about how busy I was, how I had my own life in the city, how I shouldn't have to carry so many family responsibilities. On the surface, it sounded like concern, like she was trying to lighten my burden. But the longer I listened, the more something felt wrong. Her words weren't solutions, they were direction. She was guiding the conversation toward a conclusion she had already decided. And then she said it, calmly, casually, as if it were completely reasonable. Honestly, I just need you out of the trust and off the house paperwork. Then everything gets simpler for everyone. I remember going silent for a few seconds after hearing that, not because I was shocked, but because I didn't fully process what it meant. In that moment, my mind still tried to interpret it in the most harmless way possible, that she was just talking about reducing my responsibilities, that she didn't mean anything negative. But looking back, that sentence wasn't accidental. It was precise. She said need not want. Not it might be better if, but I need. And even more telling was the order: the trust first, then the house paperwork. The two most important things I controlled. At the time, I didn't question it. I didn't ask for clarification. I simply responded neutrally, changed the subject, and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. Partly because I didn't want conflict, and partly because I wasn't ready to face the possibility that my own sister was thinking about removing me from everything. What Brooke didn't know was that the call had been recorded. Not because I distrusted her, but because it was part of my professional habit. I work in risk analysis, and any long conversation involving finances or family automatically gets saved by my system. There's a small notification tone at the beginning, though I'm not sure she noticed. After the call, I saved the file in multiple places: cloud storage, a USB drive, and sent it to my personal email. At the time, I didn't think it was important. I was just following routine. But now, looking back at everything, that sentence echoes in my mind with a completely different meaning. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan stated in advance. Brooke had told me exactly what she intended to do. And when I didn't willingly step aside, she found another way to make it happen, without my consent. That was the moment everything shifted in how I saw the situation. It was no longer about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. It was about something clear and undeniable. I had been warned. I just didn't recognize it at the time. And once you realize someone has already told you what they were going to do, you can no longer pretend that everything is just coincidence. That night, I opened the recording and listened to it again, word by word. And for the first time, I didn't try to reinterpret it in a positive way. I heard it exactly as it was. And that was also the moment I understood I could no longer go back to who I used to be in this family. After realizing the full picture, I understood that I could no longer handle this like a normal family conflict. In the past, whenever there was a problem, I would call, explain, compromise, and ultimately try to keep the peace. But this time, everything had crossed that line. This was no longer emotional, it was legal. And if I kept reacting the same way, I wouldn't just lose money, I would lose control entirely. The next morning, I went to the office exhausted. I had barely slept, and my mind was still processing everything from the night before. When I opened my laptop, the spreadsheet was still there with the $143,214 total, staring back at me. But this time, I didn't see it as a summary of the past. I saw it as evidence, proof of what I had done, what I had contributed, and more importantly, what rights I actually had. Marcus, my colleague, was the first to notice something was off. He didn't ask too many questions, but his eyes lingered longer than usual on my screen. Finally, he asked a simple question. That money, is it what you're owed or what you gave away? Somehow that question broke the last layer of my defenses. I didn't answer right away, but then I started explaining. Not the entire story, just the main parts. The voicemail being removed from the family group, the house, the trust, and the signs of fraud I had just discovered. Marcus didn't react the way I expected. He didn't look shocked, didn't get angry for me, didn't say things like they're terrible. He just went quiet as if he was calculating something. Then he said something I will never forget. You don't need to call them back. You need to call a lawyer. It sounded simple, but for me it completely changed how I saw the situation. Calling a lawyer meant what it meant. I was officially treating this as a legal matter. It meant I was no longer trying to fix the relationship. He wrote down a name for me on a sticky note, a lawyer specializing in real estate and trust law. I held that note for a few seconds. Part of me still hesitated. Part of me still wanted to believe this could be solved with a conversation. But then I remembered the forged signature, the changed email, and Brooke's words on that call. Those weren't things you could just talk through. I called the lawyer that same afternoon. The moment I mentioned forged signature, I was connected almost immediately. An appointment was scheduled for the next day. When I walked into the office, I brought everything: contracts, emails, the spreadsheet, and the recording. I was no longer telling my story as someone hurt. I was presenting it as a case. The lawyer reviewed each document carefully. No emotion, no judgment, just analysis. After going through everything, she placed my real signature next to the forged one and looked at me. "You have two problems and one advantage," she said. "The first problem is potential fraud. The second is that your property is being altered without your consent. But your advantage is clear. Everything requires your signature, and they don't have it." I sat there for a moment, letting that sink in. For the first time in this entire situation, I didn't feel powerless. I wasn't the one being removed. I was the one holding the switch that could stop everything. And if I chose not to continue, everything would come to a halt. On the way home, I realized something very clearly. The moment I called a lawyer, I had crossed a line. I was no longer trying to hold the family together at any cost. I had started protecting myself. And sometimes those two things cannot exist at the same time. After meeting with the lawyer, I was no longer in a passive state. Before, I had only reacted to what my family did, pushed back when pressured, endured when attacked. But this time, everything changed. I stopped trying to understand what they were doing and started deciding what I was going to do. And the first thing I realized was this: I didn't need to retaliate. I just needed to stop holding their system together. My lawyer laid out the steps clearly. No emotion, no judgment, just legal options. Step 1: notify the bank that there was a forged signature on the property amendment. This would force them to freeze all related transactions until an investigation was completed. Step 2: as the sole trustee of the family trust, I had full authority to halt all distributions. No approval from my family was required. With just my signature, the entire $86,000 could be locked. Step 3: stop paying the mortgage. I was a cosigner, not the primary borrower. If I stopped paying, the full responsibility would fall on my mother, whose credit wasn't strong enough to support the loan alone. I listened to each step without interrupting, not because I didn't understand, but because I was imagining the consequences. If I did this, what would happen? The bank would respond. The loan would be under pressure. My family would be forced to face a reality they had never considered: that everything they had wasn't guaranteed. It existed because I sustained it. I asked my lawyer a question I felt I needed to ask. What happens if they lose the house? She looked at me directly and said, "They don't lose the house because of you. They lose it because they can't sustain it on their own. You're simply stopping your support." That answer didn't make me feel lighter, but it made things clearer. Because the truth was, I wasn't destroying anything. I was just stepping away from something I was never truly part of. That night, I sat alone in my small apartment. No calls, no messages, just silence before the storm I knew was coming. I opened my laptop and reviewed everything again: contracts, emails, the spreadsheet, the recording. Everything was ready. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt in control. The next morning, I took the first step. I went to the bank that managed the trust. The environment was completely normal: people, standing in line, quiet conversations, routine transactions. No one knew that for me, this was a life-changing moment. I met with a trust officer and presented my documents. After reviewing them, he asked what I wanted to do. I answered simply, "I want to freeze the entire trust." He looked at me for a second, then nodded. A few keystrokes, a printed form, and I signed it. That was it. $86,000 locked. No one in my family could access it, withdraw from it, or use it without my approval. As I walked out of the bank, I paused on the sidewalk. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction, just a clear feeling of lightness. Like I had finally put down something I had been carrying for far too long. This wasn't retaliation in the sense of attacking. This was me reclaiming control over something that had always been mine. And I knew this was only the beginning. After I took the first step, freezing the trust, everything remained quiet for a short time. No immediate calls, no panicked messages. For a moment, it almost made me question things. Had they not noticed yet? Or did they still believe everything would somehow go back to normal? But that silence didn't last long, because the system they were living on was never designed to function without me. About 2 days later, the next steps began to take effect. My lawyer had sent a formal notice to the bank about the suspected forged signature on the property documents. The response came faster than I expected. The bank immediately froze the refinance process. All transactions were halted pending investigation. That meant whatever plan they had, if they had one, was stopped at the most critical point. At the same time, I stopped making the mortgage payments. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, just by not transferring the money when it was due. A small action, but with significant consequences. Within days, the bank began sending notices. Official letters, warning emails, all directed to the primary borrower, my mother. For the first time, she had to face that financial responsibility without me behind her. I didn't have to do anything else. I didn't need to call, didn't need to explain. The system operated on its own. And when a critical piece was removed, the entire structure began to shake. What surprised me wasn't that it started to collapse. It was how quickly it happened. Faster than I expected. Fast enough to make me realize that everything had only been stable because I had been holding it together. About 48 hours after the notices began, my phone started ringing. This time the silence was gone. It was replaced by a storm. Calls came in one after another from my mom, my dad, and Brooke. Messages flooded my screen, stacking on top of each other, as if every passing minute brought another demand, another question, another accusation. What's going on? Why is the bank calling? You need to fix this right now. Gone were the cold words from the voicemail. Gone was the distance. All that remained was panic. I looked at my phone and read each message slowly. What I realized wasn't just that they were worried. It was that they were unprepared. They had prepared to remove me, but they had not prepared for me to remove myself from everything they depended on. In their minds, I would react the same way I always had, trying to fix things, trying to stabilize everything, even after being pushed away. But this time was different. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I no longer felt the need to react on their timeline. For years, every time they called, I answered. Every time there was a problem, I was the first to fix it. But now I just sat there watching my phone ring and fall silent again. A different kind of silence, not abandonment, but choice. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because they needed me. And once you see that difference, you can never ignore it again. The system didn't collapse because I destroyed it. It collapsed because for the first time I stopped holding it together. After the storm of calls and messages, one thing became clear very quickly. They hadn't changed their behavior. They had only increased the intensity. Before, everything was subtle, indirect, wrapped in polite requests and unspoken expectations. But once the system started to collapse, their approach became more aggressive, more direct, yet the core remained the same. They weren't trying to understand what had happened. They were trying to pull me back into my old role. Brooke's messages came the most. She stopped calling and started texting continuously, one message after another, as if trying to control the narrative. The first message: "What did you tell the bank? You need to fix this right now." Not a question, an order. The second message, a few minutes later: "This isn't about you and me. This is about the family. You're putting everyone in a dangerous situation." I read it and could almost predict what would come next. And I was right. The third message: "Everyone was just upset. Mom didn't mean it like that. You're overreacting." And finally, the fourth: "You're being selfish. Vivian. Seriously selfish." I put my phone down after reading them, not because I was affected, but because I wanted to see everything clearly. In the past, I would have reacted immediately, explaining, justifying, trying to calm things down. But this time, I didn't. I observed. And after observing long enough, I noticed something important. None of those messages contained an apology. Not one mentioned the voicemail. Not one acknowledged the forged signature. Every single one was focused on one goal: getting me back into the role they were used to. I began analyzing the messages the way I do at work. The first blame, shifting turning my actions into the problem instead of theirs. The second, using family as a shield, making me feel like I was hurting others. The third, minimizing reducing their actions to temporary emotions. And the fourth, labeling selfish a word they knew would have worked on me before. The frightening part wasn't the words themselves. It was that they had always worked. I had changed my decisions before, just to avoid being seen as selfish. I had accepted unfair situations because they framed it as family. But this time, looking at it from the outside, I saw it clearly. It was a pattern. A repeated formula used whenever they needed me to do something I didn't want to do. I picked up my phone again and sent one message: "My lawyer will speak with yours." No explanation, no argument, no emotion, just a boundary. A few seconds later, the typing dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, Brooke replied, "Are you serious right now?" I didn't respond. The conversation ended there. For the first time in years, I wasn't pulled into that cycle. I didn't try to prove I was right. I didn't try to make them understand. I simply chose not to participate. And strangely, once I stopped participating, their entire strategy stopped working. Have you ever been made to feel selfish just for setting boundaries? If yes, comment 4. The meeting was scheduled 3 days later at my lawyer's office. Not at home, not at a familiar cafe, but in a neutral space where emotions held little weight and everything was defined by evidence. When I walked into the room, they were already there. My mother sat upright, hands clasped, her expression tense but controlled. My father sat beside her, silent, as always avoiding eye contact. Brooke leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between defiant and defensive. And next to them was the family's lawyer, a middle-aged man, flipping through a folder. No one spoke when I sat down. No greetings, no small talk. The air felt heavy, as if everyone knew this wasn't a normal conversation. My lawyer began briefly stating the purpose of the meeting, to clarify issues regarding property ownership, the trust fund, and potential legal violations. The word family was never mentioned in the opening, only assets, responsibilities, and evidence. Brooke spoke first. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her tone no longer soft, like in her messages. "We're just trying to make things simpler." I didn't respond. I let my lawyer continue. She opened a folder and slid it across the table. It was the spreadsheet I had created, all the money I had contributed over 6 years. The numbers were clear, dated, and documented. No one said anything as they looked at it, but I noticed my mother's eyes linger on the final total. Next came the house documents, the mortgage, the deed, and the amendment request. My lawyer placed 2 signatures side by side, the original and the suspected forgery. "We believe this signature is not my client's," she said calmly. The family's lawyer examined it, silent for a few seconds. Brooke looked away. My mother took a breath, as if about to speak, but then said nothing. Then came the final piece. I opened my laptop, found the recording, and pressed play. Brooke's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "I just need you out of the trust and off the house paperwork. Then everything gets simpler." No one interrupted. No one reacted immediately. The audio ended, and the room fell into complete silence. Not tense silence, just the presence of truth. My mother reacted first, not with words, but with a visible shift in her expression. For the first time, I didn't see control in her eyes, just confusion, almost uncertainty. Brooke opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped. There was no explanation fast enough to undo what had just been heard. My lawyer closed with a simple statement: "We are considering all legal options, including pursuing fraud claims if necessary." No threats, no raised voice, just a fact. And in that moment, the balance shifted completely. They were no longer setting terms for me. I was deciding what would happen next. I sat there quietly. I didn't need to say much. Everything that needed to be said was already on the table. And for the first time in this entire situation, I wasn't the one trying to explain. I was the one presenting the truth. The meeting ended without a handshake. No reconciliation. Just one clear reality: they were not prepared for this confrontation. And for the first time, I was no longer the one at a disadvantage. After the recording ended, the room fell into a state I had never experienced before. Not tension, not anger, but emptiness. A space where no explanation could come fast enough to fill the silence. In the past, whenever there was conflict, my mother was always the one in control. She would shape the narrative, manage everyone's emotions, and guide things toward an outcome that benefited her and Brooke. But this time, there was no narrative left to control. The truth had already been played, intact, unedited, and impossible to reinterpret. Brooke was the first to break the silence, but not in the way I expected. She didn't immediately deny it. She didn't say, "That's not what I meant." Instead, she tried to blur the edges of what had happened. "I was just speaking in a simplified way," she said, her voice softer than before. "I meant it would be easier to manage things, not that." She stopped mid-sentence, as if she didn't know how to finish it, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could. My mother turned to her, her expression no longer protective for the first time. "You said that," she asked, her voice steady but firm. Brooke didn't answer directly. She avoided eye contact, looked down at the table, and muttered, "I was just trying to help." It was a familiar response, but this time it didn't work. No one in the room was willing to accept it as a sufficient explanation anymore. I sat there watching everything unfold like an outsider. The strangest part was that I didn't feel angry. There was no sense of victory, no urge to say anything more. Because that moment wasn't about reacting. It was about seeing clearly. And what I saw was simple. For the first time, they couldn't control how the story was being told. The family's lawyer finally spoke. He didn't defend Brooke directly, but shifted toward practicality. "We need to focus on resolving this before it escalates further," he said. There was no denial, no argument about right or wrong, just an acknowledgement that there was a problem. And in that moment, my mother's silence spoke louder than words. She didn't object. She didn't defend. She just sat there, as if facing a situation she could no longer control. I remember looking at Brooke in that moment. Not to find regret, but to see if she understood what was happening. But what I saw wasn't regret. It was confusion. As if her plan had been prepared for many scenarios, but not this one. A situation where everything was exposed at once. No one mentioned the recording again. It wasn't necessary. It had already done its job. It wasn't the only piece of evidence, but it was the one that couldn't be argued. And in a room where everything had previously relied on words and emotions, having something so concrete changed everything. When I stood up to leave, no one stopped me. No one called my name. There was no apology, no accusation, just a different kind of silence, not strategic, but consequential. And as I walked out, I realized something important. The truth doesn't always need to be argued. Sometimes it just needs to be placed in the right space, and everything else will shift on its own. And for the first time, I was no longer the one explaining my story. After that meeting, I could have taken the situation in many different directions. I had enough evidence to push things further. File a fraud case, demand compensation, even force Brooke to face serious legal consequences. My lawyer made it clear that all of those options were available if I wanted them. But that night, sitting alone and reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something important. I didn't want to win against them. I just wanted it to end. There is a big difference between those two things. Winning means continuing to engage, continuing to fight, dragging the situation out for months or even years. Ending means stopping, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because I no longer want to invest my energy in a system that has already drained me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to choose that option without feeling guilty. The next day, I returned to my lawyer's office, not to escalate the case, but to define its limits. I made it clear what I wanted. I would not pursue criminal charges as long as all unauthorized changes were reversed and my legal rights were fully restored. I would withdraw from all financial responsibilities within the family, including the mortgage. The trust fund would be transferred to an independent third party for management no longer under my direct control. And most importantly, I would no longer carry any responsibility for maintaining this family structure. My lawyer wrote everything down and then asked me a simple question. "Are you sure?" I nodded without hesitation. Not because the decision was easy, but because for the first time I was making a decision for myself, not for them. A formal letter was sent that same day. No emotion, no blame, just clear terms. 60 days for my family to resolve their financial situation, whether by restructuring the loan or selling the house if necessary. All further communication would go through legal representatives. No more direct calls, no more messages, no more half-finished conversations where I was always the one explaining. As I reread the letter before sending it, I realized it wasn't just a legal document. It was the first boundary I had ever clearly defined. Not just in my thoughts or emotions, but on paper. And once that boundary existed, it no longer depended on whether others respected it. It existed because I chose it to exist. In the days that followed, I didn't receive much direct response. A few short messages from Brooke, a missed call from my mother, but everything stopped when I didn't engage. And strangely, instead of feeling empty like I once feared, I felt lighter. Not immediate happiness, but a quiet sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I began to understand that setting boundaries is not an act against others. It is an act of protecting yourself. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself is not by fighting harder, but by stepping away from a battle you were never meant to win in a healthy way. I don't know what my family will do next. I don't know if they truly understand what happened. But for the first time, I realized I don't need to know. Not every story needs a perfect ending. Sometimes a stopping point is enough, and that was mine. After the legal letter was sent, everything shifted out of the realm of emotion and into reality. There were no more back and forth arguments, no more direct confrontations, only processes unfolding over time and within legal boundaries. And it was during this period that I saw most clearly what I had always suspected: my family never had a system that functioned independently. They had a system that depended on me. In the first few weeks, most of the updates I received came through my lawyer. The bank continued sending notices regarding the mortgage, requesting clarification on missed payments. The refinancing process was officially frozen indefinitely due to suspected fraud. That meant they could no longer access the funds they had planned to extract from the house. Financial pressure began to build. Without my consistent contributions, without any backup plan, everything started to accumulate at once. About 3 weeks later, the family's lawyer reached out again. This time the tone was completely different. Not defensive, not confrontational, but negotiative. They proposed a solution: sell the house. It was the only viable option left to resolve the loan before it turned into a serious default. When I read that email, I didn't feel surprised. I didn't feel validated. I just felt confirmed. Confirmed that the house had never truly been theirs without me supporting it. The sale moved faster than I expected. Within less than 2 months, the house was listed, a buyer was found, and the transaction was completed. The proceeds were used to pay off the loan, and whatever remained was far less than they had once imagined. When it was over, there was no house, no loan, just one clear reality: the system they had built could not survive without my support. I was also informed that their lawyer withdrew from the case shortly after the sale was finalized. There were no further disputes, no attempts to challenge me legally. It was as if once the benefit disappeared, so did the conflict. During that time, a few relatives started reaching out to me. Not everyone, but enough for me to realize that the story had spread beyond the immediate family. Some asked with genuine concern, some out of curiosity, and some just wanted to hear my side. But this time, I didn't feel the need to explain everything. I didn't go into details. I simply said, everything has been resolved. And that was enough. What made me think the most wasn't that my family lost the house, it was how everything ended. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final showdown, just a chain of logical consequences. When a dependent system loses its support, it doesn't collapse all at once with a loud crash. It falls apart in stages, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hold it together. I didn't feel happy seeing that happen. But I didn't feel guilty either. Because for the first time I saw everything clearly. I didn't take anything away from them. I simply stopped providing something they had never created on their own. And when you look at it that way, consequences no longer feel like punishment. They simply feel like outcomes. After everything ended, what surprised me the most wasn't some dramatic transformation, but the small things. No calls at the end of the month. No messages asking, "Can you send money?" No sudden emergencies appearing. At first, that silence felt strange, almost empty. I had been so used to constantly reacting, constantly being needed. And when there was nothing left to respond to, I had to learn how to exist in that space. But slowly that space began to change. It was no longer absence, it became room. Room to think about myself, something I hadn't done in years. I started reviewing my personal finances for the first time, not in terms of how much can I give, but what do I need. I began paying off my student loans, which I had always postponed. I opened a savings account with no intention of using it for anyone else's emergencies. One morning I woke up and realized I had no one else's problems to solve, no list of responsibilities waiting for me, no invisible pressure weighing on my thoughts. I made coffee, sat by the window, and for the first time in years I felt like my time belonged to me. I started doing things I had always delayed. I booked a short trip, just 3 days, to a place I had always wanted to visit, but never allowed myself to. Standing at the airport with my ticket in hand, I realized something simple but unfamiliar. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need to justify anything. I could just go. Nothing extraordinary happened on that trip. No life-changing moment. I walked, tried new food, took a few photos. But something had shifted. I no longer felt the pull to go back and resume carrying something for someone else. I returned because I wanted to, not because I had to. Of course, it wasn't all easy. There were moments when guilt resurfaced like an old reflex that hadn't fully disappeared. There were times I wondered if I had been too harsh, if I should have handled things differently. But whenever that happened, I reminded myself of everything that had led me here, not to stay angry, but to stay clear. I also realized that this new life wasn't about escaping my family. It was about building a different relationship with myself. One that wasn't based on sacrifice or guilt, but on respect. I started asking myself questions I had never asked before. What do I want? What do I need? What actually matters to me, not to anyone else? No one answered those questions for me. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. It made me feel free. My life didn't become perfect after everything that happened, but it became real. At the very least, what I'm building now is for myself, not to keep someone else's system alive. And in a very simple way, that is enough. Looking back at everything that happened, what stays with me the most is not what I lost, but what I came to understand. For a long time, I believed that family meant unconditional giving, that love meant sacrifice, that if you tried hard enough, endured enough, gave enough, everything would eventually be repaid in some way. I lived by that belief for most of my adult life. And if there is one thing this experience has taught me, it's this: that belief is not entirely true. Family to me now is no longer an absolute concept. It is not a place where I have to prove my worth through what I can provide. It is not a place where I must trade my stability for someone else's. I've come to understand that love cannot exist if it only flows in one direction. And sacrifice without limits stops being a choice, it becomes an obligation that binds you. The hardest part wasn't walking away from that system. It was changing the way I saw everything. In the past, whenever something went wrong, my first instinct was always, what can I do to fix it? Now that question has changed. I ask, is this fair to me? And that shift, small as it seems, has influenced every decision I've made since. I also learned that boundaries are not something you set to push others away. They are something you set to define, where you end and where others begin. Before, I believed that saying no would make me a bad person, that refusing to help would cost me my relationships. But the truth is, if a relationship only exists because you keep giving, then it was never truly balanced to begin with. There are still days when I think about my family, not with anger, but with a distance I never had before. I no longer try to analyze every action or ask why they did what they did, because in the end, the answer doesn't change anything. The only thing I can control is how I respond and how I choose to live after everything. If someone asked me whether I regret it, the answer would be no. Not because everything turned out perfectly, but because I learned things I would never have learned if everything had stayed the same. I learned how to say no without guilt. I learned how to see my value beyond what I can give to others. And most importantly, I learned how to stop. My life now no longer revolves around holding everything together. It revolves around building things that can stand without requiring me to sacrifice myself. And that, even if it's quiet and not dramatic, is the biggest change I've ever experienced. I don't know what the future will look like, but for the first time, I don't feel like I have to carry it for anyone else. And that alone is enough for me to keep going. After everything settled, I started looking back, not to assign blame, but to understand. Not to justify what happened, but to see each person in the story clearly, including myself. Because if I didn't understand it, I might repeat the same pattern in a different relationship, just with different people. I started with Brooke. Before I saw my sister as selfish, irresponsible, someone who was used to having everything handed to her without effort. And that wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either. Brooke didn't become that way on her own. She grew up in an environment where her needs were always prioritized, where her failures were softened, and where she never had to face real consequences. When you grow up in a system like that, you don't learn how to stand on your own. You learn how to rely on others, and in this case, that person was me. My mother was the hardest to understand and the one I thought about the most. For years, I saw her as the one who made all the decisions, the one who controlled how the family functioned. And to some extent, that was true. But looking deeper, I realized she wasn't just controlling. She was afraid of losing control. Every action she took, from asking me for help to trying to keep me within the system, came from a very basic fear that everything would fall apart. And instead of building a stable structure, she chose to keep things running by relying on the person who could carry the most, me. As for my father, his silence was what I understood the latest. Before, I thought he was simply uninvolved, not part of the decisions. But now I see that silence is also a choice. Not speaking doesn't mean not participating. It means allowing things to continue. And in a system like my family's, that silence helped ensure nothing ever changed. And then there's me. This was the hardest part to accept. For a long time, I only saw myself as the one affected, the one taken advantage of. But if I'm honest, I was also part of that system. Not because I created it, but because I sustained it. Every time I said yes, every time I put their needs before my own, I reinforced how that system worked. I wasn't the cause, but I was the reason it lasted as long as it did. Realizing that didn't make me blame myself, it gave me something else: control. Because if I could help sustain a system, then I could also choose to stop sustaining it. And that is exactly what I did. Seeing each person this way, I no longer feel the need to label anyone as completely right or wrong. Not because mistakes didn't happen, but because that distinction no longer matters. What matters is that I understand how everything worked, and I chose to step out of it. They may never see the story the way I do. They may still believe I'm the one who broke the family. But that no longer affects me the way it used to. Because for the first time, I don't need their agreement to know what is right for me. And sometimes understanding isn't about going back. It's about making sure you never go back again. If you've stayed with me this far, then this story may no longer be just about me. Because somewhere in these details, you might have seen a part of yourself not exactly the same, but familiar enough to recognize. A family where responsibility isn't shared equally. A relationship where one person always gives more. A quiet feeling that you're doing everything you can, and still it's never enough. I'm not telling this story to prove that I was right, or to make anyone look bad. I'm telling it because I know what it feels like to be stuck in a role you never truly chose. The feeling that if you stop, everything will fall apart, so you keep going even when it's exhausting you. And the hardest part is sometimes no one explicitly asks you to do it. You just become the person who is always there, and everyone gets used to it. But there's one thing I wish I had understood earlier. Just because you can endure something doesn't mean you should continue enduring it. Just because you can help doesn't mean you have to help all the time. And loving your family does not mean losing yourself to keep them together. Boundaries are not a rejection of love. They are a way to protect it from turning into obligation. When you start saying no, it doesn't mean you're selfish. It means you're starting to value yourself. And interestingly, the people who truly respect you will learn to respect those boundaries. The ones who only relied on your giving will feel uncomfortable, but their reaction is not proof that you are wrong. It's proof that the old system no longer works. I can't tell you that change is easy. It's not. There will be moments when you doubt yourself. There will be times when you feel guilty even when you've done nothing wrong. But if you keep seeing things clearly, if you keep asking, "Is this fair to me?" you will eventually find your own answers. And those answers don't have to look like mine. Maybe you choose to stay and change how you participate. Maybe you choose to leave completely. There is no single right path for everyone. What matters is that you realize you have a choice. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Your value is not measured by how much you can sacrifice for others. It's measured by how fully you can live as yourself. You don't have to wait until everything breaks, like I did, to start changing. Sometimes a small decision, one time you say no, one time you choose yourself, is enough to begin. My story ends here, but yours is still being written, and you have the right to decide where it goes next. There was something I used to believe: no matter what happened, family would always be the place I returned to. Not because everything was perfect, but because I believed that in the end, it was the only place I truly belonged. But after everything that happened, I came to accept a truth that took me a long time to understand: not every place you once belonged is a place you should return to. I didn't leave in a dramatic moment. There was no door slammed shut, no powerful declaration. I simply didn't go back. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't check on what they were doing. And over time, that distance became normal. Not because I forgot, but because I no longer needed to remember in the same way. There are days when I wonder, what if things had been different? What if I had spoken up earlier? What if I had set boundaries sooner? What if I hadn't agreed to so many things that made me uncomfortable? But then I realized those questions don't change the present. They only keep me tied to an older version of myself, the one who always tried to fix everything even when it was no longer necessary. What I carry with me now is not loss but clarity. I know who I am when I'm not playing a role others assign to me. I know my value isn't in how well I can hold everything together, but in how I can build a life that doesn't require me to sacrifice myself to maintain it. And I know that walking away is not failure. Sometimes it's the only way to begin again. I'm not saying you have to do what I did. Every story, every situation is different. But if you find yourself always being the one who carries everything, who understands, who compromises, who sacrifices, maybe it's time to pause and ask yourself, what happens if I stop, not to break everything, but to understand whether what you're holding is truly yours to carry? Because there's a simple truth I learned too late. You cannot build a stable life on a foundation where you're not allowed to stand firmly. And you cannot keep a system alive if it only works when you are constantly losing yourself. Today, when I look back, I don't see a tragic ending. I see a necessary stop, a moment when I finally chose myself. And maybe that's something I should have done a long time ago. If this story made you think, don't forget to like and subscribe, to support me, and to see more stories like this.